the key terms of the topic. We're going to give a topic breakdown. Then we're going to go into the current events that are like sort of outlining that topic, sort of giving us a background to what we're talking about with the fossil fuel legislation now. And then we're going to discuss, or we're going to have like a case list for traditional debate, and then some starting points for traditional or for progressive LE cases. So we'll first start on to the key terms. The first term, or I guess first main thing, is the resolution as a whole is that the United States ought to prohibit the extraction of fossil fuels from federal public lands and waters. So we'll go into each of these terms individually. Probably be thinking about how each of these terms interacts with the others and how this interacts with the current events going on right now, and think about how these terms can interact to create a case. So the first term is going to be the United States. Like usual, this is going to be defined as the U.S. federal government. Generally in like that's even more clear based on the inclusion of federal public lands still, but you're probably going to see some shiftiness with the U.S. definition. But generally, like the U.S. federal government is a pretty solid stance on that. Yeah. So next, the big or the next big word is going to be prohibit. But I'm going to break from the slides for a sec and just there was a little bridge word in there between the United States and prohibit, and that's ought to. So that's again that LD phrase of instead of using a policy or PF definite or like phrase of should, LD uses the phrase ought to signify some moral obligation to do something. On to prohibit. Prohibit means to prevent, which means the affirmative has to do something to prevent through law these fossil fuels from being extracted on these federal public lands. That means that neg ground includes circumvention as a defensive argument. And the neg needs to push back on the AF using fiat in order to guarantee all extraction stops, because prohibit doesn't necessarily mean that it will guarantee elimination. But generally, those sort of debates are a little bit more difficult and a little bit more unclear. So generally, like the way that you should think about it is the United States is going to pass some sort of law that's going to prevent the extraction of fossil fuel. So going to be the key points for in terms of how things are extracted. There are technical subsets on all of these methods. Between mining, fracking, and drilling, all three are methods of extraction. But there's also different subsets on how things are mined, how things are drilled, and how like where fracking happens, all of those sorts of things. So those are very clear instances for specification. It's likely that we'll see AFs that prohibit a certain method of extraction. I think a super common one is going to be fracking, where previously on that water topic for policy, which I'll refer to quite a bit, there was a whole AF that was just the fracking AF. So there's a lot of previously existent literature and prep on preventing or on prohibiting fracking on these federal public lands. There's also a good amount of literature on preventing other types of extraction, such as mountaintop removal coal mining, which is one of the main ways that coal is mined. And then strip mining coal, which is also a surface mining technique. These sorts of techniques for mining are pretty invasive and pretty problematic. So it's going to be pretty easy for people to make those distinctions and like make those specification arguments without losing too much ground. However, again, the more that you specify, the less ultimate solvency you're going to be able to have for your big stick impacts. So that's just something to be aware of. The next key term is going to be fossil fuels. Another potentially significant area of specification. Like generally, you're going to want to specify what fossil fuels you're trying to prevent from being extracted. Generally, those are clarified as petroleum, coal, and natural gas. But there are outliers. There are other things that technically qualify as fossil fuels. So you should look into those if you want to do like a weird little tricks aff that's trying to squirrel away from everything. Generally, like those three are going to make up the most of the cases that you'll see. And it's realistically likely that you'll primarily focus on oil and natural gas, as that's what's currently expanding the most in the US. So something to look at would be the extraction of tar sands, which is an extremely viscous form of oil that is a lot dirtier to extract. Again, with regard to natural gas, the extraction of natural gas through fracking, which is widely considered to have disastrous impacts in terms of increasing the frequency of earthquakes or increasing like water contamination. So those are all very easy specification areas that you'll want to look into if you're trying to do a specified AF. And the final term is going to be federal public lands and waters. This is probably the most difficult term in the resolution for you to really define. 28% of land in the United States is owned by the federal government, and that land is going to be, you have to make the distinction between what is federal land and what is federal public land. Federal public land would be places like national forests, national parks, national wildlife areas. What's not federal public land but is federal land would be something like a military base. These are all different instances of like federal land where you can specify. It's also important to mention that there are state and local public lands that are not included in the resolution, so make sure that you don't make the mistake of conflating the two when you're cutting cards. That's going to be especially important whenever you're cutting like hyper-specific impacts or like examples of where these things are happening, because a lot of the time these things take place in state land or locally owned land. There are about 3 to 4 different agencies that mainly control this land, but the one that you're probably going to focus on the most is going to be the Bureau of Land Management, or the BLM, because it owns most of the land that it manages for extraction, as well as the land that's leased out to private extractors. You also might want to look at the U.S. Forest Service, because they own some of the land that is also being extracted from. And then you should definitely do some research to familiarize yourself with the complicated area of like, what is this extraction here? How does it work on federal public lands? Another important thing is that indigenous reservations are not federal public land, but there is some overlap in terms of the land that indigenous people are able to use and federal public land. And a lot of the times, federal public land, in terms of like land that is organized and owned by the Bureau of Land Management for the purpose of fossil fuel extraction, is very close to indigenous reservations. So that could also be another key impact. And then the last key phrase is going to be waters. The literature about specific like waters, where this is, like federal public waters specifically, is harder to pin down, but it should probably be pretty simple to just define or to just make the arguments that like the waters that you're discussing here are going to be just general territorial waters, and off-sea oil rigs is where this is going to be most effective or most specific to, because yeah. But basically, a whole res AF would entirely eliminate offshore oil rigs, because yeah, the AF is going to try and spec certain bodies of water, just as they're going to try and do with land, or certain areas of water, just like they're trying to do with land. So like Gulf Shore oil rigs versus like Arctic oil rigs would be another area of specification. I'm going to hand it over to Brock for the current affairs.
All right, so I just have one slide for current affairs, because like there's so much more I could dive into with this, but it really just stems down to the fact that fossil fuel extraction on federal public lands is very common. When I first started researching this topic, I sort of like upon seeing the topic, my sort of intuitive reaction was, oh, this is like really specific. I doubt there's that many fossil fuels being extracted from federal public land. That just seemed like, why would it happen on federal public land? But actually, a fourth of fossil fuel production in the U.S. comes from federal public lands. That's 1.4 billion metric tons of just CO2, not even including other greenhouse gases that ultimately stem from the extraction on federal public lands. So some recent happenings, I suppose, in this area. Really, the main thing is the Biden administration's like both rhetoric around this issue and also actual policy action on this issue. So first, during Biden's campaign, there was a promise to stop leasing public land for fossil fuel extraction. That wasn't really followed through on. Over 6,000 leases for oil and gas drilling on federal public lands have now been approved since the start of the Biden administration, and that really gets at a key mechanism through which this topic works, which is the fact that when fossil fuels are being extracted, the way it happens most of the time is there's federal public land that the government owns, but then they lease it out to private extractors that are then going to extract and sell those fossil fuels. So they issue a bunch of leases and things like that. And that's how the federal government still technically owns the land, but they're not always the ones who are like doing the drilling themselves. The Biden administration has, and by the way, all these links that are on the bottom of these slides, I'm going to paste in the chat at the end of this presentation. But there's a New York Times article that I source here that explains that the Biden administration has recently moved to make leases more expensive, though. So they're trying to sort of cut down on the amount of leases that are happening. Similarly, the Inflation Reduction Act sort of tried to reduce the fossil fuels extracted on federal public lands, but that was through demand side incentive changes. So there's movement against this, but there's not really been a strong push to outright prohibit it. Just another interesting quote is that a quarter of all crude oil, more than a tenth of all natural gas was produced on territory owned by the federal government in 2021. An interesting thing that I'll talk about later is that some of this is exported and some of this isn't. It's kind of hard to find exactly how much of the U.S. fuel exports come from federal public lands. But finding this out might actually be very useful because this topic will deal a lot with geopolitical arguments and things like energy independence. And so finding out exactly where this production goes might be useful. All right, so I'm also going to take the traditional debate section. We'll just jump right into the AF. So I think obviously the biggest or one of the most common stock arguments on this topic is just going to be, like the climate change AF. This is like intuitive. It's just going to be a whole res AF. There's a lot of lit here. It's just going to be that, look, reducing fossil fuel production is necessary to fight climate change. This is going to be super common because so many schools already just have a ton of files from other topics, even other resolutions, as Patrick mentioned, the policy resolution, that might talk about this topic and specifically might talk about fossil fuel production and how emissions cause climate change. As I mentioned before, if over a quarter of U.S. emissions, or if over a quarter of U.S. fossil fuels come from federal public land, and that equates to like 1.4 billion metric tons of emissions, that's going to be a key argument, is that prohibiting this is going to reduce those emissions. One thing to mention, though, is that the AF might be a little constrained on solvency here, because if you think about 1/4 of the US's total emissions, there's still a significant reduction in the globe's emissions, but definitely not enough to reverse the effects of climate change or even make a significant dent in the fight against climate change. So another super key argument on this topic, but specifically when running this AF, will be proving that US leadership on climate change is key to solving it. When it comes to framework for these climate-focused apps, likely going to be util, or maybe depending on if you're going to change, if you're going to specialize in structural violence impacts, you'll have structural violence. But by and large, the most common app will be a big stick extinction impact util climate app that will just be, establishing that it's greenhouse gases and CO2 that causes climate change. Fossil fuels produce these things. Extracting them enables these fossil fuels to be burned and produced. This is really bad for the environment. The app has solvency because they prohibit this. That's going to be probably the biggest one. There's also, and I'll talk about this later, you can see some apps focused on the more direct health impacts of emissions rather than like the extinction scenario of climate change. Another one, indigenous rights. Patrick talked about this a little bit when we were discussing the terms, but some apps might try to argue that the extraction of fossil fuels from federal public lands disproportionately harms indigenous lands and people. And so these apps will probably focus less on the broader effects of climate change, although they very well still may. But they'll probably focus more on the direct harms of extraction itself. Things like threats to land, animals, health of humans, etc., will be key impacts, especially because, as we've noted, a lot of these federal public lands are very close to indigenous communities. They're oftentimes on lands that were forcibly taken from indigenous groups, and now the government's coming in and allowing people to sort of destroy the environment on these lands. So this would be a very strong affirmative argument that sort of takes a different approach rather than just going for extinction. So in terms of framework, things like structural violence, maybe Rawls's veil of ignorance, Rawlsian conception of justice will be good ones here. This sort of links into the other ones, but I wanted to talk about it on its own slide. That's just, in general, the direct harms of extraction. I could definitely see many affirmatives going for a maybe less big stick, but maybe a more like a more solvency-oriented approach where they're looking at the specific and inherent harms of mining, fracking, and drilling to nearby communities. So like health impacts from the pollutants reduced in the air from those, things like that, sort of similar to the indigenous argument. And probably fracking will have a special focus in these apps. So I think these are good because I think you can prove more solvency for these. You don't have to do as much of connecting the link chain of this is going to reduce emissions enough, or this is going to cause US leadership to be strong enough that there's actually going to be significant dents made in climate change and stopping us from hitting a 1.5 degrees Celsius warming benchmark. These are a lot easier to solve because if you can prove that the prohibition on fracking, or not on fracking, on extraction in general is going to work, then you're going to be getting access to a lot of your impacts when you're just talking about the health of these communities. Again, another one that can like interrelate with the other arguments, but is still worthy talking about on its own, is the idea of a green transition or a green economy. AF might try to argue that, look, if we're reducing fossil fuel production by this much, a quarter of fossil fuel production, that's going to help us make a green transition. It's going to boost the economy. It's going to make the economy in general more climate resilient. It's going to lead to a lesser reliance on fossil fuels, and that means more reliance on renewables. That means more renewable innovation. So that means not only will the economy be more resilient against climate change, but also this sort of, again, goes into the idea of reducing emissions. So I could see this pairing very well with an extinction impact for climate change. Again, frameworks for this, utilitarianism, structural violence, depends on what you want your impacts to focus on.
I also want to mention on the I also want to mention
no,
on
go
the
ahead, go ahead.
Yeah, I also want to mention on the green economy that this is pretty resilient to like impact turns, like the impact turns of like development and degrowth are both pretty good, or are both pretty good generally against like economic contentions and economic impacts. But because this is like reading a economic resilience as a function of improving the environment, a lot of these development like canned impact turns aren't going to work very well against something like this.
Mm-hmm. Speaking of development and degrowth, this one, just again, one I just sort of threw in there. I thought it was interesting. Maybe not the strongest argument. Again, goes into the green economy thing. But you could maybe argue that the app even enables an economic restructuring that would stop endless growth and consumption. And that, as the typical degrowth argument goes, this is key to fighting climate change. It's key to also just improving general equity and building an equitable economy. So I think that the AF does sort of have a strong link to this, because if the AF can prove that a lot of the US economy is built on fossil fuels and fossil fuel production, hampering a huge source of that production through prohibiting extraction on federal public lands would sort of maybe, with the right cards, you could prove that this will cause the US to restructure the economy, focus less on using cheap, expendable sources of economic growth and just always vying for that endless growth, and maybe focus more on making the economy more equitable, making the economy something that's more climate resilient. Another one that sort of deviates from the theme of these previous ones is the framework of international law, or fulfilling international obligations or agreements. If you're not familiar with this framework, it essentially says that fulfilling these obligations is inherently good, and when it comes prior to other moral considerations, because we need some sort of unified international system that works well in order to, care about all these other things effectively. And this one is relatively straightforward, because the affirmative just has to prove that this is the U.S., taking steps to meet their obligations on the international stage when it comes to things like the Paris Climate Agreement or other climate accords, or other just simple, like even verbal pledges to other countries. If the AF says, this is inherently a good thing that we're working towards this and reducing emissions, therefore, this is good. This argument is like, this framework isn't consequentialist, but the argument still sort of is, because it's requiring that the affirmative can actually prove that emissions decrease. So again, you're still sort of getting into that solvency argument, where you're probably going to have to claim that U.S. leadership on climate change spills over to other countries. Okay, this is one more. It's deep ecology, which essentially says that harming the environment is inherently a bad thing. We're all part of one ecosystem. And so even when we're not putting harms to the environment in the context of humans and how that affects humans, it's inherently bad to harm the environment. This one's also pretty straightforward, because you just have to prove that fossil fuel extraction harms the environment, which is pretty much impossible to prove otherwise. There's almost no one out there saying, hey, this extraction is actually really good for the biodiversity or local ecosystems or whatever. So this is where you get access to a lot of maybe biodiversity impacts, again, emissions, things like that. So this is fairly straightforward, but again, it's an interesting direction to take the AF, and I don't think that many AFs are going to do this, because this framework in general is not super popular. Okay, one more thing. This one is probably my least favorite. I can still see someone running it though, but it's the idea that extraction would violate the social contract, because the government is failing to protect lands that are technically owned by the people. I just think that's kind of iffy, because of the complicated mechanics of how that's leased out to private extractors. But I could still see this working out, or I could still see someone running this well. Okay, for neg, I put a lot on the slide because it all sort of has the same theme, but there's just so many different ways that you can take the negative arguments here. And that's overall this idea that U.S. hegemony is good, U.S. dominance and global superpower is good, / usually China hegemony is bad, or maybe you'll have Russia in there, but usually U.S. hedge good, other country hedge bad. That's the basic line of reasoning. But it can vary at a lot of points. It's always pretty much going to say that maybe fossil fuel extraction is happening now. There's your uniqueness to the disad. We'll probably explain that the AF is going to make the U.S. less energy independent, going to make it more dependent on other countries, or maybe that AF just directly is a hit to the U.S. economy. And either one of these would decrease the U.S.'s soft power and ability to project power across the globe, and have good leverage when it comes to negotiations. And then from there, there's many different internal links that the negative can take. They all sort of lead to the same thing. Probably most common will be China or Russia, stopping China from doing things, stopping Russia from doing things, stopping Iran from doing things, etc. There's probably, whatever form it takes, there's going to be some sort of energy independence and how that interacts with hegemony argument. You could also see some turns from the AF saying that actually green energy is key to U.S. hedge, just something to keep in mind. One specific scenario that I think will probably be common, and I might mention this on a later slide too, but that's this idea that Europe is relying on a lot of exported U.S. fuels because of sanctions on Russia. They don't want to, provide help for Russia's war effort. And so a large part of Europe's sort of contribution to the war in Ukraine is not accepting that Russian fuel. But that means that Europeans are depending on other countries to supply them fuel, including the U.S. So the negative might argue that if we affirm and prohibit this extraction, we're going to decrease exports to Europe, which is going to overall diminish Europe's ability to have leverage over Russia. Russia's going to have more leverage over Europe in turn, and that very much complicates the geopolitical situation. Probably some sort of nuke war link there, things like that. In terms of impacts for this general hegemony argument, it's going to be the typical ones of hegemony key to preventing war, hegemony key to globalized economic growth. If it's focusing more on why another country's hegemony is bad, you might see people talking about how China being emboldened leads to a war in Taiwan, or it leads to more oppression of the Uyghurs. Essentially, like I said, I can't go into all of the aspects of the different directions the negative can take this because there are so many. Another key negative argument is going to be sort of, one of the most stock arguments on any environmental topic, which is just going to be that the app harms economic growth. Probably going to include some sort of uniqueness about how the economy is recovering now. And they're going to explain that the fossil fuels are key to the U.S. economy and growth, which is pretty true. I think it's pretty hard for most affirmatives to undermine this idea because the U.S. economy is by and large built on fossil fuels and fossil fuel consumption. So I think it's pretty hard to disprove this link. And therefore, by the AF, constraining 1/4 of U.S. production of fossil fuels, that's going to undermine the basis of the U.S. economy and the fuel regime, and therefore slow growth. The U.S. can't grow if they don't have this fuel that is really the engine and the underlying aspect of growth. And from there, we have recession or depression. And then there's a litany of typical impacts that you'll see from that. Maybe it'll focus on poverty, it'll focus on unemployment, it'll focus on war, etc. I think this argument could easily be combined with the U.S. hedge argument because, as I mentioned before, not only does energy independence in and of itself allow for U.S. hegemony, but so does economic power that allows for the soft power that maintains U.S. hegemony. And so if you have this sort of double whammy, I guess, of not only is the U.S. energy dependent on other countries, but its overall economy is slowed, that could be two very, very strong links to increase your risk of offense on hegemony arguments. Okay, another one that I think is interesting and that is smaller in scope, but probably a lot easier to prove, is that there's some communities that depend on the singular industry. There's some communities that are built around the fact that there is federal public lands nearby that some massive company has come and leased out and is extracting oil or natural gas on. Now, so the argument here is that obviously all of a sudden a prohibition on this industry would be devastating to these communities, but it would also be devastating to working class people as a whole. It's typically going to be not very well paid, blue collar workers in dangerous jobs when they're working the oil fields, working fracking stations and drills, working in the mines, etc. All of this, if as I said, 1/4 of U.S. fossil fuel production comes from federal public lands, then that's essentially 1/4. Recommend running something that's more focused on disadvantaged people or low income people, like Rawls or structural violence. And again, this could also be very well paired with the economic argument. Okay, another one similar to economic growth, but still different enough, is inflation. And that's the fact that decreasing the supply of fossil fuels will cause inflation throughout the economy because that's just higher input prices that end up getting passed on to consumers. I mean, it's a fact of the U.S. economy that when fuel prices go up, the prices of everything tend to go up. And so you'll have your typical inflation impacts here, harms people in poverty, harms U.S. economic growth. Again, you can go into the U.S. hegemony argument, explaining how this will harm U.S. soft power and the way they project that power. I think pairing this with economic growth to create a sort of stagflation NC would be pretty strong, explaining how if we don't have enough fossil fuels, that both decreases employment, that decreases growth, but it also increases inflation. So you have a situation of stagflation. Subset of this argument would also be focused on how low income people use fossil fuel sources for heating their homes, or not even just low income people, but just people in general. Usually people that are able to heat their homes with renewable energy, usually that's more expensive. When it comes to the majority of people, they're going to be using fuel companies that use energy derived from natural gas or oil or coal. And so if the prices of those go up, the price of energy goes up. and so the average family's bills when it comes to heating and all that stuff are going to be higher. Also, potentially, I could see that causing some strains on the power grid. So, maybe finding the technical ways in which fuels are used in the U.S. economy, that could be a good idea if you want to run this argument. Okay. Another one, I don't really like this one too much because it gets into the sort of like complicated legal issues of exactly how the business of extraction is done on federal public land. But that's the libertarianism argument. That would just be arguing that, look, the AF is going to they're violating the property rights of leaseholders on this land. These leases, maybe in the contract, it's for a certain number of years. The AF is just all of a sudden prohibiting extraction on the land. Maybe that isn't going to work, or maybe that's violating their property rights. In my opinion, this argument is complicated with the fact that the federal government technically owns the land. They're not selling the land to companies to extract it from; they're leasing it, which is different. There's going to be some complicated legal issues. It really depends on like the actual lease contracts and what they say and what the app does. Is the app all of a sudden rendering these contracts null and void? But despite the complications, I think that some people are still going to run this. It's going to be worth looking into this argument about rights, property rights. One thing that's I'll mention that later. Okay, so very common negative arguments, as there are on any topic, but I think it's common enough that I mentioned on slide, is going to be no solvency as a defensive argument. As I said earlier, slightly over a quarter of U.S. emissions or of U.S. fossil fuel production, and that leads to emissions as well. There's a study done on that. Comes from fossil fuels extracted on public land, and so on a global scale, the AF probably won't be able to easily claim to do anything majorly significant to reduce climate change. Now, of course, you're going to have AFs saying that, look, we're still moving closer towards addressing climate change than not. And so when we think about reducing existential risk on a sliding scale, you should still affirm. But either way, negatives will probably need to make that argument in nearly every debate because that's one of the clearest ways you can attack solvency. But also, I think being really prepared for debates over whether or not U.S. leadership on climate change leads to a sort of like international push against climate change or a spillover, and whether or not that solves, I think debates on that are going to be really key. And so as the negative, you need to be prepared to really hit the app on that, explain why U.S. leadership doesn't solve. I also think evidence about prohibition not working will likely be useful. This is where I'm going to talk a little bit more about the leases again. The reason this is a little iffy is I think that compared to other topics that have stated something like prohibit or ban, if you remember the lethal autonomous weapons topic that said states ought to ban lethal autonomous weapons, that was sort of like an extreme of it seems like that's like pretty easy to circumvent. But when you have a system in which the majority of extractors on this land are either A, the federal government itself, or B, people who are on lease with this land and don't own it, it would be fairly easy to enforce a prohibition on that because you cancel the leases, you can enforce the prohibition on that leased land. And if it's the federal government itself that's doing the extracting on certain lands, well, obviously that it's going to obey itself. So I think that circumvention arguments, while they are still a good idea to make, I think they'll need to be better researched than simply the idea that prohibitions on things don't work. They'll need to get into the specific aspects of how this system of extraction and the business of extraction functions. Okay, so one more thing I'm going to mention actually is this idea that, and we might get a little more into this on the circuit aspect, but it's this idea that the affirmative might also be able to specify whether or not they're prohibiting new leases and new extraction or canceling all current extraction. That could also lead to some complications when it comes to libertarianism argument. If you're thinking about, is the AF going to cancel all leases right now, no one can extract ever again, or does the AF maybe get to be shifty enough to claim that they're able to just prohibit new leases? That's up for you to research. Okay, so again, on no solvency, various reasons why the green transition doesn't happen. There's a lot of lit out there about this, a lot of stuff in people's back files probably. But just explaining here are the various reasons why the green transition won't happen. Just because we're removing fossil fuels doesn't necessarily mean that we're going to be transitioning to green energy. Another thing is maybe indigenous land will just continue to be exploited in other ways, tourism, maybe national parks, things like that, etc. So there's not really going to be a change in like the root cause of um, why indigenous rights are violated in the first place. Another thing is that extraction will just shift. Maybe there'll be an increase in state or local public lands being used for extraction. Maybe now it'll just be more heavily done on private lands. There'll be a more aggressive of a push for companies to acquire private land, um, or the extraction will just shift to other countries. When it comes to the first part of that sentence, it's important to note that you should be careful making the argument that extraction just shifts to other places in the US if you're going to make an economics argument. Because if you're going to argue that if your entire NC is predicated on the fact that there's going to be less fossil fuel production, you're completely contradicting yourself if you're then saying that the AF doesn't actually decrease the amount of extraction that happens, because then, well, the production stays the same. And there's definitely more arguments than this. This is an overview of the stock ones, but this topic, I think, surprisingly has a pretty good breadth of arguments on it. And then for circuits, I will let Patrick take that one.
Yeah, so I think the main thing for the circuit is we'll go into individually on like policy type arguments and on like critiques and fill. But I think like the main thing that you should know is that like if you're doing circuit debate, you know how this works. Like what was up above is or what was up above in the traditional debates space as well. A lot of those things still like apply. So yeah. Going into just on the AF, the first thing that we'll talk about is how or is a couple general like specific affirmative arguments. Right here, so for like LARP AFs, there are a couple things that the AF could do. You could spec the extraction methods like fracking. You could spec the fossil fuels that are being extracted, so natural gas or coal would be examples of that. You could specify certain lands or land types or places. So I think one that's going to be really common, especially because of the Arctic topic that didn't get chosen, is going to be Arctic lands, or like specking out of extraction in the Arctic, because a lot of that prep already exists. Others will be reducing future or preventing future leases from happening. I think it's important to mention, though, on that there could be an inherency claim or an inherency contest with that, because of Biden's current claim that they're going to stop those future leases. But again, these are all things to consider. Like maybe it's just he'll actually do it this time. Any combination of the above is also going to be like just exponentially making the discussion smaller, having a more pinpointed or a more narrowly focused angle to think about the topic is just what those policy spec AFs do. Solvency advocates are really common because interest groups are in abundance about why fossil fuel extraction is bad, because believe it or not, fossil fuel extraction has some downsides. So it should not be difficult to find like solvency advocates that can advocate for like specifically what you want. So that means these spec AFs are going to be a lot more common than you might like initially think, and there's going to be a large number of different spec AFs in comparison to topics like the China environmentalism topic last year, where you had maybe like 3 or 4 different spec AFs, and it was like trawlers and like, yeah. So there's generally going to be a lot more different spec AFs, because there's so many different things that you can spec in terms of extraction methods, types of extraction, and where it's extracted as well. Like generally, something that's super important for this topic and for LARP debates is going to be you have to understand the current political situation regarding these federal public lands, because otherwise you're going to end up in a mistake where you have no inherency, because what you're suggesting has already done, because the fossil fuel law right now is so incredibly complicated, and also so incredibly inconsistent depending on where you are, that you just have to be really careful that whatever specification you're running or whatever impacts you're running, even on the traditional side, you just have to be careful and make sure that whatever you're advocating for doesn't already exist, or whatever you're advocating for will actually work. Onto the philosophical debate, mainly just focus on the previously mentioned frameworks in the trad section. There's also definitely going to be other frameworks for philosophical debate. Phil debaters, they somehow always manage to find their favorite philosopher in whatever topic they want. So I have no expectation that they will not manage to do that this topic. Kant, I can imagine existing in this topic just on the basis of universality, in terms of how the AF is acting. But yeah, in terms of other major advantage areas for whole res AFs, you're gonna have big stick util AFs this slide hasn't changed. You're going to have big stick util AFs, just like was mentioned above for climate change impacts. You're going to have pollution and health impacts. You're going to have economics, and then you're going to have geopolitics. So there's nothing really, there's not a lot that's really unique about the affirmatives in these circuit debates, just other than you'll be able to spec. So it'll be a little bit easier. Onto the negative. So your core disadvantages, those are going to be mainly the things that we discussed earlier. So economics, inflation, politics. Court clog is a pretty big generic, just basically saying it's unenforceable, because you're going to clog up the courts, and as they're trying to enforce the policy, or people are going to sue the federal government, which means that there's not going to be the ability to actually enforce these things while those lawsuits are going on, even if the lawsuits are even if it's totally legal. US hedge and China hedge, those are all going to be big. And then war in Ukraine or Europe, as a result of European dependence on US fuel as a result of the war in Ukraine. I could also see some important stuff based on the current conflict in Israel, on just generally sanctions and generally fuel dependence in other countries. And then on topicality is going to be pretty simple. It's just going to be we're sending out a document after this that has some definitions. Basically, if you're planning on speccing, know what the definitions you're going to want to read are, and then be able to defend those definitions. Something that you can also make the mistake of is including lands and waters that aren't actually federally owned or public. So something that is going to be important is going to be making sure that, again, everything that you're talking about is federal public land, not state or local public land. And then philosophically, again, these are going to be pretty similar arguments to what you're talking about on the framework side for traditional debate. So you'll be fine on there. Just again, libertarianism and property rights are probably going to be big, even if I don't think that those are great arguments. And then Kant is also going to exist on in relation to the affirmatives, potential violation of contract law. Contractarianism is also probably going to be pretty big on philosophical stuff. Onto the critiques. I think that there's really three main areas of K that are maybe four that are specifically relevant to this topic. The first is going to be set call. which is going to be huge, especially since on the policy water topic, there was already a ton of research done on federal public land and on mineral extracting on federal public land and how that affects the waters, which affect indigenous people. Those also affect like fossil fuel extraction also affects water, which means that it also affects these indigenous communities. Furthermore, the AF is assuming that the federal government has the authority to even manage this land in the first place, which is stolen. And then you can argue that it reinforces the legitimacy of the authority because you're working through the state. However, that's kind of just a state bad link, which isn't great. On cap, it's probably going to be best against affirmatives that frame the resolution in a way that focuses on renewable innovation and green economy transitions. Again, if you're reading Ks frequently, you know when the links are going to work, and you know how you're going to like cap debaters and set call debaters are going to find a way to read their Ks on every topic. But these are going to be the core topic links that you're going to hit all the time. The other critiques that I think are going to be pretty big are going to be just ecological critiques. So deep ecology, ecofeminism, and object-oriented ontology, I think also link very well, even if they're not very popular. But that was my area of expertise. Generally, like the conception of things as resources is a link to anthropocentrism and object-oriented ontology critiques. And ecofeminism is kind of a similar link to security critiques, where you're using management in order to like fuel a drive to conquer nature through masculine forces. And then finally is going to be the counterplan ground. The counterplans are pretty much going to be endless. You can basically choose anything that the AF is not doing and do that. If the AF is running a whole res AF, then picks are going to be huge. 50 states CP actually is, or like the state CP actually has some pretty good ground here, but you have to be careful to make sure that it's mutually exclusive, because the state CP would argue that you would be eliminating the extraction of fossil fuels on state public land. So you have to be careful about mutual exclusivity with those two arguments. But I do think that it could be good because you access a different layer of the potential impacts and a different layer of solvency. Also common is going to be things that are increasing the regulation of extraction, but aren't prohibiting it. And you could also go for just like straight up just reading like stop new leases, and go for like what the Biden administration's original approach was, even though they haven't followed through on it. Although you could end up again in some sort of inherency debates on that. But whenever you're reading these counterplans, especially given the breadth of options that the affirmative has, you need to make sure that you're not reading something that's going to be easily permed by the affirmative. And then you also want to make sure that you're not reading something that has already happened. And yeah, that's generally what you want to think about for counterplans. Pretty much, if the app is running whole res, you get to take your pick on the number, or you get to take your pick quite literally on what you want to read. If the AF is reading counterplan, or if the AF is reading a spec AF, just make sure that whatever you're doing, it's mutually exclusive from the affirmative. So yeah, onto questions. So that's the conclusion of our main topic lecture, I guess. So we have a little bit of time to focus on questions. Open the floor up to y'all for discussion. So if you have any specific questions, raise your hand. I know that we have one in the chat that Brock can answer about international law framework.
So I'll take one about international law, and then there's a Green New Deal counterplan question in there as well. So when it comes to international law, I would say most of the time it is about actual contracts and actual law. Um, it's sort of going to depend on the specific cards you can find for that. It's definitely possible that like you could argue that it's not just about fulfilling international law as strictly defined, but it's also about filling maybe even verbal commitments. It's about fulfilling United States' role as a responsible actor on the international stage. But I would say that the majority of frameworks that you're going to find online in resources for international law are going to be focused on either actual international law or specific pledges and promises and contracts. Um, so I think that maybe, if you really want to run that framework, that it would be advantageous to you to also sort of work into that framework the idea that even respecting other non-formal agreements and commitments is a good idea for any international actor.
I'll take the one on the Green New Deal counterplan. I think that it can work, but I think that you need to be careful to make sure that it's mutually exclusive from the affirmative, because I think unless unless you contextualize it really well, it sounds like it would be pretty easy to perm, because there isn't really anything that's preventing the affirmative from just doing both the Green New Deal and preventing and ceasing their extraction of fossil fuels on federal public land.
All right. Can I take the Hobbes one?
Yeah, go ahead.
So Hobbes on neg, you would have to be very, very like you would have to find some very, very specific lit for it. I think that the Hobbesian social contract is going to be a lot weaker than like the Lockean social contract on neg, and that's because since Hobbes's main focus is about respecting the state as like the final moral arbiter, respecting the state's moral authority, and that's the social contract that that people have agreed to. I think that Hobbes, to be honest, like it's going to be hard to make that negate because the app is just going to come and claim, okay, well, like prohibiting this extraction is that's a valid function of the government under the Hobbesian social contract. It's not like directly threatening anyone's life, and so this is a completely valid function of the government, and it doesn't violate the social contract. So it would really depend on the specific cards you can find that link possible extraction to Hobbes. So it's viable, but not without a lot of work.
I'll take the topic from Chris on federal public lands. Generally, this is going to be the most difficult thing to pin down in the topic. But so you include so yes, federal public lands includes national parks, national forests, national wilderness areas, and also includes let's see, there's in the document that we have, it's got again, basically there's 640 million acres of parks, forests, preserves, and historic sites that are all open to the public as federal public lands. And those lands include ancestral homelands, migration routes, ceremonial grounds, and hunting and harvesting places for indigenous peoples who have been forcibly removed. So generally, it's going to be up to you to determine and define what federal public lands are, and how to best contextualize that within the round, because it's very much a vague term that's difficult to describe in the first place.
Yeah, I would mention that what might be helpful is if you sort of destroy any shred of connotation in your mind of like public land as like just a park or like public land as like emphasis on public and just focus more on like the federal land part. The reason the word public is in there is to like separate it from things like, like Patrick mentioned, the US Army base or like the Pentagon, the actual ground that the Pentagon is on, or I guess anything in Washington, D.C. is technically federal land. That doesn't mean it's public. But what federal public land often is like literal parcels of land, just like acres. The federal government owns it, but it's public, as in anyone can come to the federal government with a valid reason to lease it out for something. And then there's regulations surrounding that, but a lot of it's just like sparse, empty land that isn't being used.
Or like a specific instant or a specific example of like federal public land is national forests, where it's essentially the resource tiles of the United States, where we lease a lot of the land in in public national forests for like logging companies and fossil fuel extraction, drilling companies, where that land is used for resource extraction almost exclusively. There's very little recreation that goes on in national forest type areas.
I can talk about this one for a little bit first, but then pass it to you, Patrick. So I think that sort of comparison will be most viable if you're presenting if you're going for some sort of argument that explains that allowing people to use public land for private profit is a bad thing. Um, and so I think that's maybe going to be um, like the strongest way that can link in any argument. I'm not sure what you mean by if it could link into econ, but I do think it would be a decent comparison to make. Again, if you're trying to make that argument that public land should not be used for private gain, and that especially things like fossil fuels should be considered like public goods that everyone should have access to. They shouldn't be monopolized by companies.
Yeah, on that earlier description, I think kind of Brock kind of hit the nail on the head with that one. Like generally, I think the best way to think about that is like it might be a useful comparison in terms of making like a value claim about why a value claim about why uh, about why we have like private for-profit industries like making their conducting their enterprises on federal public land, but I don't think that it would be terribly useful in a sort of like economic way. If you expand on that in the chat, I can maybe give some feedback.
So okay, I'll talk about a little bit Chris's too, and I think this will probably be our last question. We're a little past the time. Um, so yeah, so I think honestly the main example of an outright ban is going to be um, like the prohibition that's for like national parks. Um, and that's because when it comes to other types of federal public land, they're almost the way the federal government has attempted to control it, extraction on other types of federal public land has one, they haven't really attempted to control it that much up until the Biden administration started having some rhetoric about controlling it. Um, there's sometimes specific pushes to have certain, like very specific certain lands excluded, um, or specific like areas of offshore drilling excluded. But I think in general, there isn't the best precedent for the ban is just sort of them not allowing it in national parks. But that's because that if you think about it, the federal government, because they own the land, it's a lot easier for them to control who uses that land by just controlling who they lease to, or changing the price of the leases, or changing the way they lease this land out. And so when it comes to actual like prohibitions, there's less precedent because a lot of it's just like turning the dial on those leases and finding the right amount of leases to issue. Anything to add?
Yeah. Hold on. I'm pulling up the page for the Bureau of Land Management. Basically, they operate like they operate like the federal mineral estate, which is a like certain like sections of federal public land where oil, gas, and like oil, natural gas, and coal are all extracted from. So that would be an example of that federal public land where currently like we're extracting fossil fuels from. So yeah, those come from the Bureau of Land Management's federal mineral estate is some keywords that you can look up. If that answers your question. All right, cool. So I think we're about done. Thank y'all for coming. And yeah, if you have any more questions, you can feel free to add them in the EIF Discord or in the pretty much any of our channels. We're posting the slides for this as well as the we prepared like a companion document to go with it that has a couple definitions, some old critique links, the old critique links. I'm not sure where that's going to be published, but it will be published after this. So keep an eye out for that.